Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome into a new episode of Capitol View, a weekly webcast brought to you by the Daily Journal and djournal.com, talking about state government, what's going on in Jackson. Bobby Harrison, our Capitol Bureau Chief, of course, filling us in on all the details. Coming to you every Monday about 2 o'clock. If you miss it live, just catch the replay later in the day here at djournal.com. So glad to be with you on this Monday. And Bobby, how are you doing, sir?
All right, Brad, you doing all right?
Can't complain too much, man. We got a couple of things we want to talk about today. This shouldn't take too long, so thanks for spending the next few minutes with us. Let's talk about we talked about this some last week, I believe, the sports betting possibility of it. Just quick background, some legislation that was passed really directed toward legalizing fantasy and regulating fantasy sports in Mississippi, Bobby. Has, according to pretty much all the experts, also opened the door to legalize sports betting. That's contingent, of course, on a Supreme Court ruling expected to come down next year regarding a federal law that prohibits it in most states. So with that background, Bobby, you had a story talking about how it might help the state's casino industry, just the gambling industry as a whole, Bobby. So is it something that is there any kind of consensus on how big an impact it could have?
Well, we don't. I mean, not from anybody who would actually know. I tried to talk to Darren Webb, the state economist, and he said he hadn't really crunched any numbers. But Brad, there was speculation and talk about if Mississippi casinos were allowed to offer sports betting, that it would mean as much to the state revenue as it did in the early 1990s when the casino industry first kind of burst on the scene in the state, and state revenue grew by double digits for several years in the 90s. But Darren Webb said that's not likely that it's going to have that impact because, in the 90s when they were, the casinos had such impact on the state's economy and on revenue collections. You were building all these massive buildings, and so construction money from construction was pouring into the state and into the state's coffers for revenue. And so you won't have that with sports betting. I mean, I would assume they'd just. I've never been to Las Vegas, but I assume that they just somewhere in the casino is a room where you can go in and wager a bet on the baseball games tonight, the Cubs and the Cardinals or whatnot, and you're not talking about completely massive new buildings for sports betting. It's just going to be a room in the existing casino. And the way the casinos have been going to Mississippi in recent years, as far as their popularity declining, there should be a lot of vacant space for those sports betting facilities to operate from.
Yeah, I believe the gaming industry kind of peaked in 2008, and it's been kind of in a steady decline since then, Bobby. So you wonder how much of a boost sports betting could give it. I mean, you mentioned Nevada. That's like the gambling epicenter here in the United States. I think sports betting only accounted for maybe 1.4% of all gaming revenue up there.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised by those numbers. But the people who kind of talk about the impact of sports betting say it. People who I think it was Scott Delano, a House member from the coast, who was instrumental in getting that bill that you were talking about earlier through the legislature in 2017. Gave the example that in a slow time for the casinos in Mississippi is January and February. And that's a busy time in the sports betting world because you got bets on the NFL football playoffs and on the Super Bowl, and so people might be coming to the casinos to traveling to the casinos to make those wagers, and they might stay to eat a steak or to play some blackjack or play on the slot machines. So his argument is that it would help the casinos just not by the revenue coming in for sports betting, but these people would come and it'd be more feed into more people into casinos, and so they'd be doing more things, and so it would be a boosting arm for casinos. Which, I mean, Brad, you got the numbers in front of you, I think, but the casinos don't account for as much of state revenue as a lot of people think they do. You're talking about what is it? My recollection is 3 or 4% of the entire state revenue collection is from the casino. Yeah. So they're not the impact a lot of people think they are. It's the state would be in revenue wise would be hurting without them, but it's not a huge slice of the state revenue collections.
Yeah, casino revenue for the just completed fiscal year was less than 2.5% of total state revenue. So that's gone down definitely over the years. And so,
Yeah.
you had Sean Tyndall, you quoted a Republican from Gulfport. You're talking about, what if sports betting is legalized, say, in Arkansas, but not here? He says it will close the casinos in Tunica. Is that a bit of a
Yeah, that's why they, they're
well?
kind of having.
Is that a bit of an overstatement, though? I mean, if it's not going to be that big an impact anyway.
Well, I mean, I think it would. I mean, you got to. He made those comments in light of the fact that the casinos at Tunica have been, sort of struggling for the past 10 years or so. So people forget that in the heyday of the Mississippi casinos in the 80s, not in the 80s, in the late 90s and early 2000s, the casinos on the river were outperforming the casinos on the coast. But that's, then Arkansas legalized gambling and casino gambling, and Louisiana expanded casino gambling. And so that's not the case anymore. The coast casinos now bring in more revenue for the state than the Mississippi River casinos do. And so he was making the point that if Arkansas has sports betting, Mississippi doesn't, it's just going to pull more people from Mississippi over to the Arkansas side of the river. But what's interesting in that comment, I thought, Brad, was, Tyndall and Scott Delano both said when they passed that legislation during the 2017 session, they were not talking about, they were not trying to legalize sports betting because they realized it was outlawed by the federal law. But interestingly, now they're defending it, saying if we don't have sports betting and Arkansas does, then we're going to really struggle with our casinos here in Mississippi. So we got to have sports betting. So they're kind of having it both ways. They're saying, well, we didn't mean to have sports betting, but now that we have it, we need to keep it.
Well, it's kind of reminiscent of the lottery question, and you've written about this at length, Bobby. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence that people cross state lines to play the lottery in Tennessee, Louisiana, or what have you, or Arkansas. And, that's money that could be spent here. And so I guess that's kind of the same line of thinking with the sports
right,
betting.
Same line of thinking. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's switch gears a little bit here, Bobby. Let's talk about the auto industry. We'll go from the gambling industry to the automotive industry. There was a study released last week talking about the impact that the automotive industry has on Mississippi. Of course, we know has had a big impact over the last several years here in our region with the Toyota plant over at Blue Springs. But this study that was presented last week says that automotive is the fastest growing industry in the state and that it's provided 7,200 new jobs since 2010, Bobby. So how much did you learn from this? Was there anything there we didn't know, or just kind of give us some real solid numbers on what we suspected?
Well, it gave us some solid numbers, and I've always contended that when the Nissan plant was recruited to the state in the early 2000s, it was such a huge deal. The Nissan plant, of course, is in Canton in central Mississippi. That led way to the Toyota plant that you mentioned that was located in Blue Springs up in northeast Mississippi. Well, I think it opened, Brad, in about 2010 or 11, somewhere around there.
Somewhere in there.
And so without those plants, the economy of Mississippi would really be suffering. You had other, the furniture industry is not, it's kind of come back some, but its heyday is what was probably, as far as just number of employees, it peaked years ago. And so you had so many other industries that have left, and the Nissans and the Toyotas and all the industries that they bring with them, the suppliers and stuff, have just kind of filled those voids. So, the to a lesser extent, but still important, important level. The Toyota plant was so important to the state, but if it wasn't for the Nissan plant down in central Mississippi, the state would have really been in sad shape as far as, because through the sort of, while other industries were leaving the state, these industries were kind of filling the auto industry is filling the void.
Yeah, and they have such a far reach. They affect more than just the towns or counties they're in. You just look at the manufacturers of parts, like as your story says, 32 counties have plants or what have you that manufacture parts for the automotive industry. So I mean that's a lot. And then you also, we're talking about Nissan and Toyota, but like in Tupelo here, we've had Cooper Tire for years. Now we've got Yokohama down in Clay County. That's a pretty recent. So it's one of those industries, Bobby, that just kind of has these tentacles that kind of spreads all across the state.
Yeah, and in the area of the state, Brad, in Northeast Mississippi, probably more counties than not have some type of auto industry or auto supply industry in the county. So it's tremendously important to Northeast Mississippi.
And just looking at some numbers here that you have in the story, the auto industry accounts for 5.7 billion of the state's total gross domestic product of $90 billion. It accounts for an estimated $568 million in local and state tax revenue. And related to this, speaking of the Nissan plant, there's been a big push to let the workers there unionize. And as people know, the Mississippi is a right to work state. You don't have unions, but this is something that could change, Bobby. I don't know how that would affect things.
Well, there's going to be a vote, I think, later in August, and it's going to be a big deal. Part of the reason most people believe that there's been, that most of the new auto makers are located in the South is because the union influence in the South is not nearly as strong as it is in the Midwest. Detroit used to be the mecca for automotive manufacturing in not only the nation but the world, you could argue. And so, but a lot of those industries have moved to the South, and the reason they've moved to the South to a large part is because the union doesn't have the influence. And now the union is trying to move into the South and regain some of that influence. And there's going to be a big vote at the Nissan plant in August, and that the plant's going to close down or anything until the union comes in. But there are people saying that it could hurt the plant. Other people are saying that union leads to better paying jobs. The unionization leads to better paying jobs, better benefits. So it would actually help the employees at the plant. And since there's like 6,000 employees at the plant, if it helps them, it'll help the state's economy overall. So we just have to see how that plays out.
All right. Well, good stuff as always, Bobby. You can read more about these stories we talked about in the Daily Journal or at djournal.com. Give Bobby a follow on Twitter at Bobby Harrison 9. And that'll do it for this episode of Capitol View. Good stuff as always, Bobby.
Appreciate it, Brad.
All right. And we will see y'all next time. Have a good one.